Well, good morning, and thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for the invitation to be here. This was a church I used to attend occasionally, and if I say that was about 30 years ago, that makes me feel old too. And I was talking to some of the young adults this morning, and most of them weren't born when I used to come to this church, so, we get put in our place regularly. One of those questions that we often spend time with, and we kind of assume that it's the foundational question to our, even to our faith, is, does God exist? And what I'd like to suggest to you this morning, that there's actually a more important question for us to spend our time on. We can spend our time with philosophy and science and throw in a bit of theology and try and come up with these nice arguments for does God exist. But I think this question, what is God like, is a more important question. Because as our new atheist friends have pointed out to us, if God exists but is not good, then God's existence is not good news. God becomes this kind of scary cosmic monster if God is not good. And so this question, what is God like, is actually the core question to our faith. And I guess then there's a number of follow-on questions, of course, and one of them is, so how would we even know? And one of the ways that we kind of try to answer that question is that we can't know God. If we have God all packaged and neatly bottled up, then that's not God. Because the whole purpose of God, the whole definition of God is something far beyond us, bigger than us, something unknowable. If your God is not unknowable, then you're not worshipping God, you're worshipping a cartoon character that you like to consider God. And so we need to say, okay, so we start with this definition that we can't really know God. So how do we know God? And the theologian's answer to that is that we know God by what God does. Or if you want to get a little bit further, we know God by his self-revelation. That when God introduces God's self to us, we should kind of take notice of that. Because that is God telling us what God knows that we need to know about what he is like. So with that kind of starting point, let's consider the story that we've gone through a couple of times this morning, and I'm so glad I chose the burning bush, and I'm so glad we didn't burn the church down in the process. So thank you for sharing that with us. But when we get to this story, we have one of the key moments in the Bible, the history of God and his interactions with people, where God introduced God's self to us. And that's why I think it's such a significant story. We need to take God seriously when God tells us what he is like. And it's fascinating what happens in this situation. Let's set a little bit of context here. We start off with something that we've got, and it probably wasn't green grass, as nice as that animation was. We've got some pretty serious desert. We've got Abraham as a wandering fugitive, former prince of Egypt. And he's basically become, out of necessity, a shepherd. He's wandering through the wilderness, probably with more questions than he knows what to do with. He's on the run, and has been for 40 years, which, that's a long time. But it comes after 400 years of what might be regarded as the silence of God. God has been absent in the story of his people. He grew up with these stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and how God came to them and he made all these great promises. And then it went quiet. And as it went quiet, the people were subjected to slavery in the land of Egypt. And then God turns up in this strange, burning bush. And God introduces himself as the same God that had talked to those patriarchs so many years before. And he points out and says, these are the stories you've heard. Those stories are true. That's what he's saying. Those stories you've grown up with, that wasn't just a make-believe story. That was me. And then he says something even more significant. And we were commenting about how repetitive those verses in the Bible we read were. There's kind of these repeated themes about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but also something else, that God has seen the oppression of his people. That God has heard the cries of distress because of their harsh slave drivers. I am aware of their suffering. The cry of the people of Israel has reached me, and I have seen how harshly the Egyptians abuse them. This is repeated 3 times over the few verses that we read this morning. God introduces himself as the God who sees, the God who hears. It's something that he comes back to again when Moses asks him the question and says, I have been watching closely and I see how the Egyptians are treating you, and I have promised to rescue you. So there's something significant going on in these verses. Not only when God introduces himself, but also when God repeats himself, we again should be taking extra notice. And there's a few things that I think we can draw out of this little story, this introduction by God. The first one is that injustice can go on for a stinking long time. These people have been suffering for generation after generation after generation. And one of the challenges that comes with that is that injustice can become to feel inevitable, become to feel normal, as just a part of the way the world is. And what God is saying here is no. Injustice that goes on for a long time doesn't make it any less unjust. Oppression that goes on for centuries is no less oppression than it was when it began. In fact, if you actually look how history often works, it gets worse over time, as layers upon layers are added to the sufferings of people. And one of the things that God, through Moses, first wanted to break through to the people was simply this idea that no, it is not right. I have noticed it. It needs to change. We're going to do something about it. In this way, theologian Walter Brueggemann makes the comment that Moses' work is nothing less than an assault on the consciousness of the empire, aimed at nothing less than the dismantling of the empire, both in its social practices and its mythic pretensions. The world around us spends so much time trying to convince us that the way things are the way they ought to be. And what are you going to do about it anyway? So simply, suck it up, make the best of it, look out for yourself. And the voice of God comes through this and says, no, there is my intention for what it means to be a human being. There is the way the world ought to be and the way God created human beings to flourish. And that is something we should always be called back to. 400 years is a long time to endure successive generations of slavery, oppression, and exploitation. But that doesn't mean that it's something we should simply surrender to. God says, I have actually seen this. I need to do something with it. I need to change it. The other thing that is fascinating is while we see that he introduces himself as the God of Abraham, God of Isaac, and God of Jacob, when he introduces himself as I have heard your cries, I have seen your suffering, he's actually saying something else as well, which is, I am the God of Hagar. If you go back to Genesis chapter 16, we have this story of an Egyptian slave woman who has been wronged by Abraham. So Abraham's not always the good guy in the story. And so Hagar found herself pregnant because of their machinations in the household of Abraham. And she escaped out into the wilderness and was sort of, do I die here? I'm a slave, I'm Egyptian, I'm inappropriately pregnant, I'm a runaway. And she recognizes that even in that moment, God is with her. And this is this very significant moment because this is the first name that is given to God in the entire Bible. Hagar used another name to refer to the Lord who had spoken to her. She said, you are the God who sees me. So I think it's an amazing affirmation that when God reappears in the story and reintroduces himself centuries later, he uses this same description, this same name. He's saying, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, but I'm also the God of Hagar. I am the God of the forgotten and the dispossessed, the God who recognizes and looks out for the people who are excluded from the story. The reality is that God knows us. That's a beautiful reality, but he particularly knows those who are most in need of his attention. You can see a parallel for this in the teaching of Jesus, where he said, "Not a single sparrow can fall to the ground without your Father knowing it. And even the number of hairs on your head are counted by God. So don't be afraid, because you are more valuable than many sparrows." God knows us. He knows our circumstances. And even though it may feel like a long time, he comes and reintroduces himself after this period of silence. But there is a question. And of course, there are those preachers that think that when they present, they need to answer all your questions. But that just doesn't make sense, because there are questions even in this story. You know, this is an amazing story, but there's a question that begs right in the middle of this, saying, so if God noticed, what's he been doing for 400 years? That's to me, seems like a big, ugly, messy, awkward kind of question. Perhaps that's why God appeared in a burning bush and got Moses kind of a little scared first, so there wouldn't be too many impertinent questions. But there's the real question here of, so where have you been, God? And I think many of us have those experiences in our lives. You know, God sees, we have this incredible truth. God hears the cries of those who suffer. God recognizes the outrage of injustice and oppression. But it's still going on. It's still in the world all around us. Why? Why does it keep going on? It's a fascinating thing to have a faith that has those realities, those real questions, unanswered in the middle of it. And I think we just have to leave it there. I can't answer that question. This sermon isn't going to provide you an answer to that question. But I like the fact that it's allowed to just hang there. It's a tension that we live there in the midst of this call to faithful action in the world. Nonetheless, there's a fascinating verse at the end of the next chapter. So Moses has this experience. He confronts God. God confronts him, sends him back to Egypt. He gives him this message and these magical sticks turning into snakes and some of these things. And he goes back to the people of Israel, those that are still in slavery. They are still experiencing the reality of injustice and oppression. And at the last verse of Exodus chapter 4, I think it gives us a fascinating insight. When they heard that the Lord was concerned about them and had seen their misery, they bowed down and worshipped. They didn't have their questions answered. They didn't have their situation resolved. Nothing had changed except a message from God that says, I've seen and heard, and I will act. But again, that's still a promise. But that was enough to bring them to worship. And I think there's something significant in there. That the response to the goodness of God, the response to what God is like, once we truly get a glimpse of it, will bring us back to this point where they worship. In their experience, God could no longer be dismissed as an absent parent, a cruel monster, or some kind of disinterested observer from afar. God could no longer, there had been lament and suffering and unanswered questions, but God had heard. God had revealed himself. God had reintroduced himself into their story. And so they worshipped in response and to their renewed understanding of what God was like. So what was God like? Remember, that's the question we're trying to work out a little bit this morning. God was like this story. God had seen, God had heard, God knew them. God was there, God would act. This was a story that would be retold and retold pretty much every year through the rest of the history of the Israelite nation. You know, with Passover, they retold the story of the Exodus. And as it would be retold later in the Hebrew Scriptures, in Deuteronomy chapter 7, The Lord did not set his heart on you or choose you because you were more numerous than the other nations, for you were the smallest of all the nations. Yet God was faithful in honoring the people, in honoring his promise to their ancestors, and he rescued you with such a strong hand from your slavery and from the oppressive hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. It was the defining moment in their history and in their understanding and knowing of God. In the context of oppression, God was not neutral. And I think that's a really significant thing for us to reflect upon. In this announcement to Moses, God firmly took a side. In history, God takes sides. It has revealed something important about what God is like. And as the theologian James Cone put it, if God had chosen as his holy nation the Egyptian slave masters instead of the Israelite slaves, a completely different kind of God would have been revealed. That's a fascinating thing to reflect on. When God steps into history, he steps into intentional places, intentional moments, and God is always on the side of the oppressed. This would be a defining moment, not just in their history, but also in what the nation would become. And that's a significant thing to reflect on. It's one reason why this question is so important, because the God we believe in, what God is like, will very much influence what we become. It sets the pattern for what our lives will be. And God continued to define himself past this point. And one of the places that he made this promise to Moses back at the beginning, at this beginning point, and he said, "You'll come back to this mountain and worship me." And so they did. In Exodus 20, we have that. And God, in what we usually talk about as the 10 Commandments, introduces himself again to these people and says, "I am the Lord your God who rescued you from the land of Egypt, the place of your slavery." But not only was this the foundation for their relationship, it was also the foundation for the entire system of what their new nation would be. In a number of places, for example, Exodus 22, God gives them instructions about how they were to care for the poor and the foreigners and the widows and the orphans and the whole of the land that they would inherit. And it would come back to, remember, you yourselves were once foreigners in the land of Egypt. It changed their relationships with others in very foundational ways. The laws of Israel were intended as a step forward amongst all the cultures of the ancient world. This was something new and different that God was doing. Even Deuteronomy, that kind of recaps all these laws, gets to the point of saying, "And what great nation has decrees and regulations as righteous and as fair as this body of instructions that I am giving you today?" This was to be the sort of the foundation for a new society. And at times, in our larger Christian world, we have people that have, and in the last few years, these kind of statements have rattled around the Christian ecosystem, which have talked about, if your church talks about justice, you don't want to be part of that kind of church. Or social justice is some kind of dangerous thing. This is a story of God doing justice, God doing social justice, where he set up a society in which people would be free, would be allowed to stand on their own 2 feet, allowed to escape oppression and exploitation. God did social justice, and so his people will be people who are about social justice as well. As Ellen White, in our tradition, has reflected on the laws of Deuteronomy and the laws of the Pentateuch, she makes this comment: "There is nothing after their recognition of the claims of God that more distinguishes the laws given by Moses than the liberal, tender, and hospitable spirit enjoined towards the poor." This is what God is like in how he has revealed himself in history. What is perhaps less appreciated is the depth that this justice was built even into the apparently straightforward commands. If we go back to the 10 Commandments, this foundation foundational statement, foundational introduction from God, where he says, I am the Lord who brought you out of slavery in Egypt. Says, so you won't worship other gods, you'll worship me. So you won't build idols like the other nations, you'll be a different kind of nation. So you won't take my name in vain, because I am the Lord that did that for you. So you will remember Sabbath, and you'll practice Sabbath in a way that actually is for the benefit of everybody else before it's for your benefit. It's for the people that most need the rest, who are the ones who are specified in the fourth commandment. In Patriarchs and Prophets, Ellen White goes further in explicating some of the later commandments. Talking about the sixth commandment, she writes, all acts of injustice that tend to shorten life, the spirit of hatred or revenge, or the indulgence of any passion that leads to injurious acts towards others or causes even to wish them harm, a selfish neglect of caring for the needy or the suffering, all self-indulgence, all unnecessary deprivation or excessive labor that tends to injure health, all of these are to a greater or lesser degree violations of the sixth commandment. Similarly, thou shalt not steal, the eighth commandment, she talks about both public and private sins are included in this prohibition. The eighth commandment condemns man-stealing and slave dealing, forbids wars of conquest. It condemns theft and robbery. It demands strict integrity in the minutest details of the affairs of life. It forbids overreaching in trade and requires the payment of just debts or wages. It declares that every attempt to advantage oneself by the ignorance, weakness, or misfortune of another is registered as fraud in the books of heaven. There's some old language in there, but if you actually look at some of the things that are included in there, all of a sudden these commandments are not quite so simple. From hatred and revenge to neglecting the poor and the suffering, from self-indulgence to overwork to how we invest, from human trafficking to fair trade, war and exploitation of all kinds, a God of justice commands people of justice to work for justice and liberation in a world of injustice and oppression. It is one of the most important ways we can offer a meaningful answer to the question, what is God like? If someone asks us, or if we're exploring the questions for ourselves, does God exist? Or what is God like? One of the answers that God has given us is this story. This story of God reintroducing himself to his people through Moses, a God who heard and responded to the cries of the oppressed. And of course, this story is not a story that has to stand alone. These themes are continued through the story of God's people, the refrains of justice and God's concern for the poor and the oppressed, that God knows our world and our lives, and that even how God regularly takes the side of the least and the outsiders. We find their fullest expression, of course, in the stories of Jesus. We've seen these things all the way through, from the Psalms to the Hebrew prophets, and then we get to Jesus, and in Matthew 12, Matthew uses the words of Isaiah to describe the mission of Jesus, where he talks about one who would come, who would proclaim justice to the nations. Even God's final promises of judgment are ultimately about setting wrongs right, undoing the oppression of evil, and remaking the world as God always intended it to be. When God reintroduces himself in some verses that will be quite familiar to us in an Adventist context, in Revelation 14, we have this introduction of God saying, worship God, because he was the one who will judge. He is the one who will do justice, set wrongs right. That is what we are called to do. And of course, if we're called to acknowledge that, we're also called to practice it and to live it out in the ways that we can. To be people who aspire to follow this God of justice, it will shape our engagement with the world around us. Many of us live with a tension that Martin Luther King Jr. described, where we're uneasy with injustice, but unwilling yet to pay a significant price to eradicate it. But stories about what God is like will change us. We become more attuned to see and to hear. We notice the stories of tragedy in some different ways. We hear the cries of the oppressed that we are tempted to ignore or diminish. But at the same time, we do not need to be overwhelmed by the scale or the weight of tragedy in the world around us, because we have a foundation for responding. We have the whole resources of God to respond to the injustice in the world around us. We resist the temptation to see injustice and oppression as inevitable and unchangeable, no matter how entrenched or how long they might have been. And we claim the promise that God made to Moses in response to his questions about his feelings of inadequacy in response to this call, where God simply said, "I am with you." That is the promise we take with us back out into our society, back out into the world around us. We begin to speak and to act, knowing that we are not God, but that we are God's people, and that He is with us. Like Moses, we are sent back into our world, perhaps to rally the people and to confront the most powerful rulers in the land, or perhaps to serve with kindness and practice hope in the everyday things of our lives. In recognizing that God has heard and responded faithfully, we worship our God of justice. And in each and all of these ways, we continue to discover and share the answer to that all-important question, what is God like? God sees and He calls us to see. God hears and He calls us to hear. God acts and calls us to act in the world. And finally, He will cause justice to be victorious, and His name will be the hope of all the world.